Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Mansueto, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our Product of the Month event. Today we're going to be taking a look at SSRS, which stands for SQL Server Reporting Services. SSRS is the server-based report generation software which Infor has chosen for SyteLine. SSRS can be used to prepare and deliver a variety of interactive and printed reports. Today's presenter is Dean Giberson of Godlan. Dean has worked with SyteLine all the way back to the days of Cymix in 1995. He's worked both on the development as well as the implementation side since that time. Dean has been chosen as a presenter for Sun conferences many times over the last 8 years, as well as Cymix World, and a number of times also for Inforum. Folks, at the end of Dean's presentation, we're going to take some time for Q&A. During the presentation, all attendees will be muted. You won't have the opportunity to speak, but you will have the ability to submit your questions through the chat panel, so please do that. If you submit those as we go, I will read those off at the end for Dean to then address them. At that, I'd like to turn this time over to Dean.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to go through and give you some highlights of SSRS and some critical things you kind of need to know if you're going to use SSRS with SyteLine. I think the information you're going to see today will at least give you a starting point. There's a couple good documents on Infor support that I recommend you download, all related to SSRS reporting. And certainly if you Google SSRS, there's more tutorials out there than you can imagine, and they're all fairly good. But the critical things I want to go over today are things that you'll need to know related to using SSRS with SyteLine. I want to start by showing you a couple things that you'll need to know. Number one, typically if you've got both a utility and a database server, typically SSRS is going to be installed on your database server. Again, it depends on your setup and your IT staff and who actually did your installation, but that's typically what I've seen at most customer sites. What we're looking at on the screen, and hopefully you can see it clearly, is the Reporting Services Configuration Manager, and that can be found under the Start menu, under All Programs, under Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2, if that's the version you're on. If you're on 2010 or 2012, it should be in basically the same place under Configuration Tools. You're going to look for Reporting Service Configuration Manager. Now, obviously, if it's not there, that means it did not get installed when you installed your SQL Server. And that can typically happen because SSRS is not a default install. What you need to do is make sure that as you're going through the install wizard, or whoever does your install, that you expand the tools section and click off on the reporting services checkbox, and that will install everything. Once that's done, you'll come in and you'll define your reporting manager setup. Now, the thing that's going to be important for you to know once you start doing any reporting is two URLs. This one and this one. This one particularly is the one that when you set up your first SSRS project, you will need to know this information so that you can enter it into your Business Intelligence Development Studio. Business Intelligence Development Studio is actually a cut-down version of Visual Studio. Again, that's in 2008. In 2012, I believe it's called Visual Studio. They changed the title. And again, you can get to that in the same basic spot. It should be right here. Again, if you don't see it, it probably is because on the install of your SQL Server, it did not get checked as one of the options to install. A couple things I've also found. This is another little critical thing you might want to write down. depending on the user that you use when you log into your server, you will need to have had security set up in such a way that you can actually write to the report server database. Typically, I always run as administrator. That saves me the hassle then of running into security issues when I try to deploy the report back to the database server. Which brings me to a point. If anyone on the call has come up through SyteLine and previously used Crystal, SSRS is different in that Crystal reports used to have a .rpt file that was saved out on the utility file server in a specific location that intranet's form and SyteLine pointed to. Unlike that setup in Crystal, SSRS stores everything in a database called report server in your actual database. And so when you go into SQL Server Management Studio, you'll see actually 2 additional databases that are not specifically SyteLine, but would be related to SyteLine. So all of the data, just like SyteLine's Mongoose toolset, saves all the forms and all the roles and everything into the different databases related to your SyteLine configuration. SSRS saves its report definition into their report server database. So I won't bore you anymore with those technicalities. There's an installation guide and an administrative guide on the Infor Extreme Support page. You can browse to and find those documents, and they're very good at explaining how to set all these up and make sure that you have your reporting services set up properly. Okay, so I've come into what most people term BIDS, your Business Intelligence Development Studio. Now, the weird thing is, even though that's what it says on the start page, when you come in, it says Visual Studio. So that's probably why later in 2010 or 2012 they changed it to just call it Visual Studio right from the start menu. What I've done previously is I've actually set up a project in Visual Studio for reporting. Now, there's a couple ways to do that. Typically, I just, and there's several ways that I've seen people do this. Some people I've seen set up projects for each report. I'm not sure I see any benefit in that, but it certainly is not something that you shouldn't do. It's just a personal preference. I tend to set up one report project and then simply add all my reports to that one project so they're all together. Now, I'll go ahead and open this project. There we go. Okay, so when we come into our project, a couple things you need to make sure that you do is you need to take that URL that was in that administration screen and you need to place it in here so that when you deploy your report, it goes to the right spot. Second thing you need to do is you need to enter SyteLine reports into, assuming a standard installation, into your target report folder, because this is where SyteLine's task manager is going to look to find the report definition. Okay? So that's a couple things that you need to make sure that you set up. Once those are set up, you're pretty much all ready to go. Now, there's a couple ways that we can start from here. Typically, what I see most customers doing is changing a standard report. And to change a standard report, you need to get the one that's going to be changed, and you want to put it into your project so that you can use it. Now, I downloaded one in preparation for this. So I'm going to do add existing item. And I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and I'm going to pick up the item by location report and click add. Okay, so here's our item by location.rdl file. This is an XML file that actually gets exported when you download it out of the database, and I will show you that a little later, but I want to jump right into the reports. So I'm going to double-click this, and that brings the report into our designer. And again, for those of you that are moving from Crystal to SSRS, things are going to look fairly similar to you because the report layout of SSRS is similar, not the same, but similar to Crystal in that you have a designer page, and most of the reports are going to look very similar. You're going to have your header page with all the parameter options on the first page, and then you're going to have your document sections. Okay, so from that perspective, if you use Crystal, this will look a little bit familiar. Now, some of the differences of SSRS to Crystal is that in Crystal you have basically a connection that you make, and then the stored procedure in most cases that you connect to. In SSRS, they've split those out into kind of two sections. First, we've got a data source, and then second, we've got the data set. Now, the data set would typically be a stored procedure. In this particular case, it's an IDO. That's the other thing that's been added with the SSRS reports, is that you can actually use the IDOs in SyteLine's object database that are defined to develop forms. You can utilize those IDOs to actually build reports. Now, other than that, the look and use of the data set is exactly the same. So let's take a quick look at our data source. Okay, so our data source name is SyteLine IDO. It's an embedded connection. And what that means is that you can actually have shared connections. So you can utilize the same data source multiple times. And in the SyteLine environment, they've chosen not to do that. And they actually embed all the data sources in each report. The credentials would be what you use to log into SyteLine, and those credentials will be passed by Task Manager. So what I'm going to do in this case, let's take a quick look at the data set. And as you can see, the data set needs a data source, and again, it's embedded in the report. But again, you can use shared data sets. I'm not going to go through that today because of our time. But what we're using in this data source is the SyteLine IDO, which points back to our data source here. And then the query type is going to be text. Now, text means that this is the basically the query that the IDO is going to take and form into a select statement dynamically, just like it does when the forms open in SyteLine. Okay. So that's one method that's new to to SyteLine. And because of, again, because of time restrictions, I'm not going to go into the IDO format anymore. So what I want to do now is show you how to get to this point with a report that you're going to change. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our reporting services configuration. Again, I'm going to run it as administrator to avoid any possible security issues. So we're going to go to the Report Manager URL. We're going to click on this URL. So while we're waiting for that, I'm not quite sure why that's taking on so long. The other thing I want to tell you that's also important related to SyteLine is that there are templates that you can add to your reports project that you can pull down, and they will basically give you this beginning layout for each of the different types of reports that you can use, and that will kind of give you a jump on certain things that you need. Now, back in Crystal again, you would add your parameters that you needed for your stored procedure, and the parameters were basically positional in that each of the parameters had to be in the same order that they were called by the stored procedure, or you would get things not working correctly. However, in SSRS, that's not the case, because when you're using your parameters, you can actually point name to name as to what the stored procedure is using versus what SSRS is using. Now, in addition to that, all of the SyteLine reports have these specific parameters that get shipped in from Task Manager. You can utilize these as you decide if you're starting a new report, but the one that you're going to need to always have in every report is, if you're using IDOs, you're going to use this P connection string IDO, and it is case sensitive, and it needs to be spelled exactly this way. If you're not using IDOs, if you're using stored procedures or tables, it's going to be connection string without the IDO. This is how you get connected to your database. The string is going to contain, and we can take a quick look at the parameters. Okay, so I'll jump back to that in a minute. Here's your SyteLine reports. Now, if you remember, when we looked at the properties on our project, I said you needed to fill in SyteLine reports. Now, that's assuming that you take the default name when you're setting the report server up, and this would be the default name that you would use. If you make it something different, then basically it has to match whatever your report server is. So here's the folder. And what this web page actually is doing is looking right into the report server database. And it's pulling up a list of reports within folders. Now, the folders are kind of, I'll use the word imaginary. There's not really folders in the database, obviously. but it's a hierarchical representation of what's in the database. And so I'm going to go into SyteLine Reports. And basically when I click on that, what it's really doing is it's going and doing a query into the SQL database to find all the RDLs that are there. So here's all our reports. And as you can see, for any of you that are fairly familiar with some of the reporting in SyteLine, you'll kind of somewhat recognize some of these different report names. Okay? And so what I'm going to do right now, I'm just going to pick one. I'll just pick this general ledger. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click drop down, and I'm going to download it. And I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to close it, and I'm going to jump back into my, okay, so I'm sorry that I have to keep jumping back and forth here, but I'm trying to save us some time. Basically, here's the expression for connecting to that IDO. So I'm going to jump out of here for a second. So what I want to do is go ahead and go to Add Existing Item again, and I know it got put in my download folder. So here's my general ledger report. And now I can click on it. And now you can see I actually have a different data source and a different data set. And if I look at this property, you'll see that this is actually the connection string, and the type of connection this time is a Microsoft SQL Server connection, okay, as opposed to the previous one that was an IDO connection. And if I click in here, let me take that back. So if I go up to my parameters and I go down to my connection string and I look at my values, and this looks a little more normal for a SQL Server type connection. So we've got our SQL Server database name, and we have our initial database. Now, what I typically do when I first go into a report is I change this default value, and I change it to what my database, whether I'm working in a development environment or whether I'm working in my live environment, I just simply go in here and change the value of this so that it's pointing to my database server and my database. That way I'm looking at my data and I'm able to kind of preview some of the information before I deploy it and actually test it in SyteLine. And that's something I want to mention. Again, this is another SyteLine specific kind of thing, as well as an SSRS issue that makes it difficult sometimes to preview. SSRS, when you're in this development environment, caches any data that you look at. So when I hit preview and I begin to put the parameters in and view the report, that data basically stays cached in the tool while you're going back and forth between design and preview. And so if you change things in the design mode, or if you even go back to the stored procedure and change something, assuming it's not a standard SyteLine, not a standard SyteLine stored procedure, because you can't change those. You want to, when you do your preview again, you want to change your criteria fairly significantly so that it forces a refresh of the data, so that you're not just constantly looking at the same data over and over again, because that can get very confusing. So that's just something to think about as far as the preview goes. Now, the other thing, obviously, that you want to do, because you don't want to change the standard report, you want to keep that standard report that you can always go back to, as well as that's going to be the one that any upgrades or patches is going to overwrite. You want to put some kind of an abbreviation in front of your your version of that report. So I'm just going to put GDL in there because that's the typical abbreviation we use at Godlan. But you would want to pick an abbreviation and kind of stick with it so that all your reports come out together when you look at them in the report server. So again, going back to our report layout, we've got our header page here that shows what our criteria is, and then we've got our body of our report. Now, a couple things, again, that are different between Crystal and SSRS are that in Crystal, you can basically look over here on the side and you can kind of see what piece of the format you were working in. And SSRS, it's a little harder. You have to come down here and look in the properties window to see what section you're actually in the process of touching. And some of the critical things about the report size are you need to make sure that you have your margins and your page size correct. And if you're using portrait versus landscape, then obviously your sizes are going to be flipped from 11 by 8.5 to 8.5 by 11. So that's a couple things you need to consider. When I click up in here, SSRS has a thing called a tablets, and the tablets can be a little difficult to get used to. What it is a Excel-like grid that gives you rows and columns that you can place your data from your data set into. In this particular one that we're looking at, and I apologize that it's kind of scrunched, but let me see if I can make it just a little bigger here. Okay, so as we scroll through here, you can see that the person that developed this form used a lot of the SyteLine string concept to use as labels. And so for those of you that are multilingual, have multi-languages, that's basically why these strings are used. In other cases, you can see, well, now actually all the labels are strings. And so this right here in this cell happens to be one of our data set values, a property. Let's see if we can find an expression here. Okay, and then our subtotals are actually expressions. So if I right-click and click expression, you can see that it's a little bigger, that we've actually got the capabilities of doing calculations, again, similar to the calculations you could do in Crystal. And we can also do some formatting. So in this case, we're doing a running value, which is a running total, on our account unit beginning balance. Okay, so we're summing based on a group 3, and then we're turning around and taking that value and we're formatting it based on rounding it to the domestic currency value. So this is a fairly large expression. So you can see you can do a lot of things. Now, one thing I want to mention that again is a little confusing and you may have a tough time finding. When you're going to format numbers, you're actually not going to go into either math or financial or conversion. You're actually going to go into text, which confused me for a while. So you've got these format statements that actually can take the value, the number value, and then you can represent it as currency, which will put either the $ or whatever currency you're using. You can format dates. You can format to numbers, which would allow you to take some of the decimal places. As you know, in SyteLine, the cost decimal places is way out there, like 6 or 8 or something. you can bring those into a more normal. And the nice thing about these is they give you kind of an example of how the format, so you can see here, how the format that you're looking at actually works. So we can format percents, we can format currency, we can format date times, short dates or long dates, or other things. We can also aggregate, which is what we're using up here, this running value. You can do sums, mins, maxes, et cetera, et cetera. You can do conversions where you can do typical VB type conversions of switching to Boolean or byte or character, et cetera. So this is where you would come to do any extraneous totaling or add additional calculated fields to your report versus doing everything in the stored procedure. Say, I'm talking kind of fast. You guys can't ask questions. I'm sure you're dying to, but well, I'm hoping you're dying to. All right, so when we're in our tablets here, we're basically building our spreadsheet the way we want the report to look. And in this particular case, we actually have several groups here that you can that have been set up so that the data is all grouped as you would in any report. Now, the interesting thing is that within the spreadsheet, you can build as many rows and columns related to a specific group as you need. And as you can see, when I click on this group, it shows me that this whole section that got highlighted is all related to that group. So we've got some report notes, we've got the account number, the transaction number, the transaction label, all related to this group. When I come down and I click on group 2, it looks like it's all related to the same, but we can go to group properties and we can see that it's all grouped on account. Okay, and if we go to group 1, it's probably also on account. No, that's on site. Okay. So anything within the groups, your typical grouping is going to do a break when it changes. That's one other thing too. Even though I click on this, you notice I don't get a property window over here. I actually have to go right-click, go Group Properties, and that's where my paging is. So if I want to break on a given group, if I want a page break on a given group, I need to come in here and do my page breaks. Page breaking in SSRS, in my opinion, is considerably more difficult than it was in Crystal. All right, so I'll come down here and click on Details. You see that's the Details section. Click on Group 3, and that's the Group 3 section. All right, so when I go back up here, you see this little drop down shows up. I can actually take a cell and I can pick what field out of my data set I want to appear in that field, and then I can also, once it's there, right-click and go to Expressions, and I can format that value if I want it to look differently than it does. Joe, that's kind of the high-level stuff I wanted to make sure I touched. I'd like to kind of turn it back to you and see if there's been any questions.
Thanks, Dean. Folks, if you have a question and have not submitted it yet, please go ahead and enter it now in the chat panel that you have in your GoToMeeting panel off on the right-hand side of your screen. After our presentation concludes, you can still submit your questions. Just email those to me using this mailbox, info, I-N-F-O, @godlan.com. Okay, the next question actually comes from Steve. What permissions do we need to run this? And he's asking if there's any licenses.
Yeah, there aren't any licenses to the SSRS tool per se. If you're asking, well, licenses, there's like a dozen licenses. There's the Microsoft SQL Server license, there's the SyteLine license, there's all that. But basically, SSRS, again, as I kind of said in answer to the previous question, is licensed based on your SQL Server license for your database. So it's a free tool that comes with your SQL Server license. There's no license to run it. There is security, and so some people say that, mention licensing in relationship to security, but the security is basically set up when you set up your report server. Now, on a given report, let me say this, and this may not be part of the question, but I think it's worth looking at. Each report can actually have its own security built in, which if it ever comes up here, it would be really real good. So while I'm waiting for that, why don't you go ahead to the next question, Jeff?
Sure. Oh, no, go ahead, if you got it.
Okay. So as you can see, most of the SyteLine reports are going to, by default, be set up with the security of the administrator that actually set up SSRS. And this administrator user here is going to have to be the same login that you use when you set up your Infor Task Manager, so that Task Manager can access these reports. Now, you can further add additional security on a given report, excuse me, if you were going to, say, call it from the actual web service itself. So if you were going to go directly to render the report via SQL Server Reporting Services versus through SyteLine using Task Manager, you can actually build your own security into each report. So go ahead, Jeff. Next question. Now, assuming that answered the licensing question.
Steve, if there's any follow-up to that, go ahead and shoot that in the panel, and I'll ask that as well. Here's a simple one. Brian's asking if this is being recorded for later viewing. The answer is yes, definitely. We record each one of these, and we believe we put these all out on our YouTube channel. But be glad to send this to you as well. Brian is asking if we can touch on SSRS interfacing with SharePoint.
We probably could if I knew anything about how SharePoint was designed. If you're asking, can I put SSRS reports on SharePoint, the answer is yes. And the way you would do that is you would basically take the URL that points to this report or whatever report you're trying to render, and you would render that report. So let me just click on this for a second. It's rolling. It's trying. So go ahead and go to the next question. I'll hit that some more so we can get as many questions in as possible.
Got it. And Brian, as a follow-up to my answer, but recording this, we also post these to the Godlan.com website as well, so you can find it there as well. We do have one more question, unless any others roll in. This would be the last one. What is the difference between using tables and stored procedures as the data set?
Okay, let me go back to this SharePoint question.
Sure.
You can see this URL maybe. I know it's kind of small, but you can take this URL, which is actually a rendering URL, and you can actually just take that and place it into SharePoint as where you want the icon or the link or whatever you put in SharePoint. and you can actually point to it. Now, that being said, you notice it's asking for a login and password, so you would have to include that in your string here so that the person doesn't have to put that in. Or, as a security feature, you may want to go ahead and add additional security to this report, as I showed previously, and then they would have to log in before they could actually see. They would actually have to log in before they could see and view the report. Okay, so that's the SharePoint answer. I'm sorry, Joe. Give me that last question again. Oh, the difference between a stored procedure and a table. Well, the big difference is that when you use a table as your data set, let me get into the data set properties here for a minute. When you use a table or a number of tables as your data set, you basically have to build the SQL query that you're going to use in such a way that you kind of figure out how you're going to utilize parameters. So what we would do, let me click on, oh great, okay, so here we are. So basically what you would do is you would build your SQL query. As opposed to calling the stored procedure, you would just start out by saying, select asterisk from items or from item or whatever. And you could do your joins, you could do whatever you wanted to in here, but you would need to build it in such a way that you would utilize your parameter strings as your where clause. So it's perfectly doable to build your report that way, but if you've been with if you've been with SyteLine for any length of time, you know that most of SyteLine's reports have always been built with stored procedures. I think the reason is, number one, it's easier. It's easier to build logic into a stored procedure. Some of the reports in SyteLine are very, very complicated, and so they utilize stored procedures to kind of build all the logic. If you just have a straight, a straight rows and columns kind of report, I don't think there's any real difference. If you can write a single select statement and pull all the data you need, that's a very simple way to build an SSRS report, and I recommend it. So that you don't really have to learn how to use stored procedures. And it may be a security thing in your environment where they don't want you writing or saving anything into the database. So it's certainly a very workable way. I personally just like stored procedures because for me they're easier to work with, and I can test all the data output at the SQL Server level before I even come into the report. I can have my data set and determined before I get in there. Now, the flip side is you could write your select statement in a query window in SQL Server Management Studio and get all the data exactly the way you want it first, and then just copy and paste that select statement into this query designer here in SSRS.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our Q&A and our presentation. Again, please send any additional questions that you may have to info@godlan.com. We'll fire those off to Dean. We'll get those turned back around and emailed to you. I'd like to thank you for making time to join us today. Look forward to having you with us again next time. Hope everybody has a great day.